Welcome, dear listeners, to Stories by Peter Hubb. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the tales of betrayal, revenge, and life's harsh lessons that we bring to you. Today, we begin a new journey, a story of trust, loss, and the bitter taste of choices. Let's dive in. The illusion of stability. The sun spilled its warmth across the quiet suburban neighborhood, painting the trimmed lawns and tidy fences in a golden glow. In the large stone house at the corner, the Rivers family began another seemingly perfect day. Mark Rivers, at 48, carried himself with the quiet strength of a man who had built his life with his own two hands. His wife, Elizabeth, graceful at 45, moved through the kitchen with effortless elegance, setting the table for breakfast. Their home carried an air of success. Photos of vacations abroad hung along the walls, showing smiling faces on beaches and at mountain resorts. The polished wood furniture gleamed, and the scent of fresh coffee filled the air. To outsiders, the Rivers family had it all: a long marriage, 2 adult children moving steadily into their own lives, and a thriving restaurant business that had been their pride for nearly 2 decades. Mark entered the dining room with a plate of toast, his shirt sleeves rolled up, a small grin tugging at his lips. "Another busy day ahead," he said, setting the plate down. "We've got a big party reservation tonight, 20 people." Elizabeth smiled faintly, but didn't meet his eyes. "I'll stop by the florist for table arrangements," she said. Her voice was calm, practiced. She had learned the art of appearing supportive even when her mind drifted elsewhere. Breakfasts like this were their routine: light chatter about business, occasional laughter, and the familiar comfort of habit. Yet beneath the surface, faint cracks began to show. Mark didn't notice them yet. To him, their life was steady, predictable, even blessed. He reached for Elizabeth's hand across the table, but she pulled back quickly to check her phone. "Just the kids," she said with a quick smile, though the name flashing on the screen wasn't one of their children. She turned it face down before Mark could see. He let it go. He always let it go. Later that evening, the restaurant bustled with life. Soft music floated across the air as guests laughed over wine and delicately plated dishes. Mark moved among the tables, greeting patrons with warmth, his pride evident in every gesture. This was his world, the fruit of years of hard work. Elizabeth, dressed impeccably, smiled and charmed the guests, the perfect hostess by his side. But even here, where their success shone brightest, her eyes sometimes drifted, lingering on the door, on her reflection in the glass, on the glowing screen of her phone. She was present, yet elsewhere. Mark noticed the way she sighed when she thought he wasn't looking, the subtle distance in her embrace when the night finally ended. Back home, as they prepared for bed, Mark brushed his teeth and hummed quietly, content with the day's work. Elizabeth sat at her vanity, removing her earrings, her face unreadable in the mirror. When he came to bed, she offered a polite kiss goodnight, turned off the lamp, and lay facing away from him. Mark stared at the ceiling in the dark, listening to her steady breathing. Everything appeared perfect, but perfection, he realized, had grown strangely quiet, too quiet. The days that followed looked the same on the surface, but Mark began noticing little details he could no longer ignore. Elizabeth lingered longer on her phone in the mornings, her lips tightening into faint smiles at messages she didn't share. At dinner, she asked fewer questions about the restaurant, and her eyes seemed fixed on distant thoughts Mark couldn't reach. At the restaurant, the staff adored Mark. His steady leadership, his kindness, his genuine laughter. Elizabeth, though still elegant and composed, appeared restless. She criticized minor details more sharply. A flower arrangement slightly off-center, a server's shirt not pressed to her standards. It wasn't just about the restaurant anymore. It was as if she was grasping for control of something slipping away. One afternoon, Mark came home earlier than usual. The house was quiet, except for Elizabeth's voice, low and soft, speaking in the living room. She didn't hear him at first. Her tone wasn't the clipped, efficient voice she used with him lately. It was warmer, almost tender. When she noticed him in the doorway, she jumped slightly and ended the call quickly. "Just a friend," she said smoothly, but her cheeks betrayed a flush. She carried on as if nothing happened, yet a shadow had fallen over the moment. Mark didn't question her. He convinced himself not to. But a seed of unease had been planted deep inside him. Nights grew colder, not from the weather, but from the distance in their bed. She turned away more often, and her excuses about being tired multiplied. Mark, lying awake, replayed the details, the hidden smiles, the late-night texts, the warmth in her voice when speaking to someone else. Each fragment felt like a crack in the mirror of their perfect life. And still, he said nothing. He wanted to believe silence would preserve the illusion. But illusions, once broken, never heal on their own.
It began with something small, a missed delivery at the restaurant. Mark had forgotten to confirm the wine order, and when Elizabeth found out, her anger erupted far beyond the size of the mistake. "This is exactly the problem, Mark," she snapped, slamming the invoice on the counter. "You can't keep track of anything anymore. Everything is slipping because you're careless." Mark blinked, taken aback. "It was one order. I'll call them. We'll fix it." Elizabeth crossed her arms, her face sharp with disdain. "One order? No, this is just the latest mistake. You've been distracted for months. Do you even realize how much work I do to hold this place together while you're off playing the charming host?" The words stung. Mark had always believed they were a team, building their dreams side by side. Now she spoke as though he were dead weight dragging her down. "I work just as hard as you," he said quietly, his jaw tight. "This restaurant wouldn't exist without both of us." Her laugh was bitter, humorless. "Without me, it would have crashed years ago. You live in some fantasy where smiling at customers pays the bills. You don't see reality, Mark. You never have." The fight spiraled quickly. Years of unspoken grievances surfaced, her resentment at his optimism, his hurt at her coldness. She accused him of being blind, of hiding behind his easy charm while she carried the real burdens. He accused her of cruelty, of erasing the good they had built together with a single harsh word. By the end, Elizabeth stood with her arms rigid, eyes blazing with contempt. "You're a failure," she hissed, "and I'm tired of living like this." Mark felt the words land like a physical blow. He had weathered disappointment, financial strain, long nights of worry, but hearing his wife call him a failure was something he could not absorb without breaking inside. She left the room, slamming the door behind her. The sound echoed through the restaurant like a crack in the foundation. For the first time in 30 years, Mark wondered if their life together had been nothing more than a fragile illusion. And for the first time, he wasn't sure he could hold it together anymore. The following weeks carried a tension that poisoned even the simplest interactions. Breakfast became silent, mechanical. Elizabeth answered questions with clipped responses, her phone always within reach, her attention divided. The air between them thickened with unspoken hostility.
At the restaurant, she no longer masked her disdain. She corrected Mark in front of the staff, rolling her eyes when he offered suggestions. "Just let me handle it," she said once, loud enough for others to hear. "We both know details aren't your strength." The staff exchanged uneasy glances, pretending not to notice, but the damage was done. Mark's authority had been undermined, not by strangers, but by his own wife. Mark swallowed the humiliation, forcing himself to maintain composure. But late at night, in the quiet of their home, the anger returned. He replayed her words, her dismissive tone, the way she looked at him like he was less than the man she had once married. One night, Elizabeth's bitterness boiled over entirely. A small financial setback, an unexpected repair bill for the restaurant's kitchen, lit the fuse. "Do you see, Mark? This is why I can't trust you to lead. You don't think ahead. You're reckless, irresponsible. I should never have let you run this place with me." Mark finally snapped. "Let me? Elizabeth, I built this restaurant from nothing. You know that. Don't erase history because you're angry now." She scoffed, her voice sharp as glass. "You built it? No, we built it, and I've carried you ever since. Face it, Mark, without me, you'd be nothing." Her words left no room for reconciliation. They were not the barbs of frustration, but the deliberate strikes of contempt. In that moment, Mark understood something had shifted permanently between them. This wasn't a passing storm. This was the crumbling of their foundation. He stared at her across the room, the silence between them more cutting than any argument. "If that's truly how you see me," he said at last, his voice low, "then maybe we have nothing left to fight for." Elizabeth didn't flinch. She simply turned away, her expression cold, as though the marriage had already ended in her heart. The night of their last real conversation arrived without ceremony. Elizabeth packed a small suitcase, her movements brisk and purposeful. Mark sat at the kitchen table, his hands clasped tightly, watching her with hollow eyes. "Where are you going?" His voice was steady, but the weight behind it was unbearable. "Somewhere I can breathe," she said flatly, zipping the suitcase. "I can't do this anymore, Mark. Living like this, with you dragging me down, it's over." He stood slowly, as though the air itself pressed against him. "After everything we've built? After 30 years? Her expression didn't waver. 30 years of illusions. "I want more than this stagnant life. You may be content pretending everything is fine, but I won't waste the rest of my life in denial." Her words cut deeper than any fight before. Mark wanted to shout, to remind her of their victories, their struggles, the nights spent planning and dreaming together. But the fire inside him had dimmed. He saw in her eyes a finality that no plea could undo. "Elizabeth?" he whispered, but the name tasted bitter now. She lifted the suitcase and walked toward the door. Without a backward glance, she left the house, and with her departure, shattered the last fragile pieces of their marriage. Mark remained standing in the kitchen long after the door closed. The silence was immense, oppressive. He reached for the chair but couldn't sit. His body trembled, not from rage, but from the hollow ache of abandonment. The home that once felt full of warmth and laughter now echoed with absence. For the first time, Mark realized he was truly alone. The days after Elizabeth's departure blurred into a gray haze. The house, once filled with her footsteps and sharp words, now carried only silence. Mark wandered from room to room, the emptiness pressing against him, reminding him of everything he had lost. Even the restaurant, their shared dream, felt like a hollow stage where half the players had vanished. At night, sleep eluded him. He sat by the living room window, staring at the streetlights, remembering the early years, the laughter, the plans scribbled on napkins, the nights when they believed nothing could tear them apart. Now those memories stung more than comforted. They were reminders of how fragile devotion could be. Yet beneath the ache, Mark found a strange steadiness. He did not crumble. He still rose early, shaved, and went to the restaurant. The staff noticed his quiet composure, though they could not miss the tiredness etched into his face. Customers greeted him warmly, and he responded with that same soft smile he had always carried. If Elizabeth expected him to collapse without her, he refused to grant her that satisfaction. In private, he grieved. He felt the sharp stab of betrayal, the echo of her words, failure, nothing, stagnant. But rather than shouting into the void, he absorbed the pain with dignity. He began journaling late at night, pouring his sorrow into words that no one else would ever see. His handwriting wavered, but his thoughts grew sharper. He promised himself he would not let this be the end of him. One evening, he opened an old drawer in his study and pulled out a weathered envelope. Inside were documents he had locked away years ago, the remnants of a secret life Elizabeth never knew about. Underground poker nights, winnings carefully hidden, risks that could have destroyed everything but instead had brought him silent fortune. He stared at the numbers again, at the $3 million, untouched, waiting. His hand trembled as he closed the drawer. For now, the secret remained his alone, but in the quiet of his heart, a new seed was planted, not of despair, but of transformation. Mark Rivers was broken, yes, but he was not defeated. And soon the world and Elizabeth would see a man reborn from ashes.
The memories came flooding back the night he reopened the envelope. Mark leaned back in his chair, letting his mind wander to the smoke-filled basements where he had once gambled with more than money. The air had always been thick with tension, men hunched over green felt tables, their faces masks of bravado and desperation. He remembered the weight of every card, the quickened heartbeat as chips slid into the pot, and the unspoken rule that losers often paid in more than cash. Mark had been younger then, reckless in ways he could scarcely recognize now. The restaurant had been little more than a dream scribbled in a notebook, and Elizabeth was still the woman who smiled at him as though he were her whole world. But dreams cost money, and ordinary jobs weren't enough. So he plunged into the underground world of poker, not out of greed, but necessity. He recalled the first night he walked away with winnings large enough to make his hands shake. $2,000, more than a month's wages at his day job. He hid the cash in the trunk of his car, driving home with a grin he could not wipe from his face. Elizabeth never asked why he looked so alive that night, and he never offered an explanation. It was their unspoken bargain. She wanted stability, and he would find a way to provide it. But the stakes grew higher. Nights stretched longer. He began to learn the art of reading opponents, the subtle tells that revealed truth beneath their bluffs. Some games ended in triumph, others in disaster. But Mark's discipline sharpened. He never drank at the table, never played beyond his limits. Slowly, he built a reputation, a quiet storm among gamblers, the man who walked away more often than he crawled. And then came the game that changed everything. It was a private table in the back of a warehouse, the kind of place where even the shadows seemed to whisper warnings. The buy-in alone was $10,000, money Mark didn't have, but borrowed at risk of everything. Around the table sat men with eyes like wolves, men who lived and breathed danger. He should have walked away, but something inside him, perhaps desperation, perhaps pride, kept him rooted to his chair. The hours blurred into dawn, card after card, pot after pot, until finally the room erupted in stunned silence. Mark had taken it all. Every chip, every dollar. When the dust settled, he was $3 million richer. But with the victory came a burden heavier than any debt, the need to keep the fortune hidden, silent, and safe. For in that world, money wasn't just wealth, it was blood in the water. And so Mark crafted his secret. He placed the winnings under a long-term contract, inaccessible until the right time, untouchable by anyone but him. Not even Elizabeth, especially not Elizabeth. Now, years later, as he held the envelope once more, Mark wondered if those nights had been worth it. The risks, the lies, the secrets that built the foundation of their life. He had saved their dream, but in silence he had also sown the seeds of its destruction. And for the first time, Mark considered that maybe the betrayal hadn't begun with Elizabeth. Maybe it had begun with him.
The morning the letter arrived, Mark almost didn't open it. He thought it was another bill, another mundane reminder of responsibilities that had piled up since Elizabeth left. But when his eyes fell on the sender's seal, the financial trust company, his heart gave a sharp, painful thud. With trembling fingers, he tore it open. Inside was the notification he had waited years to see, the release of his fortune. $3 million freed at last, transferred into accounts that only bore his name. For a moment, he simply sat at his desk, staring at the words. Then, slowly, a smile curved his lips. Not the weary, polite smile he offered customers at the restaurant, but something different, sharper, stronger, alive. Mark closed his eyes and exhaled deeply. The weight he had carried for so long, the secrecy, the helpless waiting, lifted like chains falling away. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He had power, opportunity, a second chance to redefine his life on his own terms. That evening, he drove past the glowing windows of the restaurant and didn't stop. Instead, he walked into a hotel downtown, booked the penthouse suite, and stood on the balcony overlooking the city. Below him, the streets shimmered with life. He whispered to himself, "This is only the beginning." Over the next weeks, his world shifted. He invested with precision. Real estate, small businesses on the brink of collapse, the kind of ventures others overlooked, but he saw potential in. His quiet demeanor masked a razor focus, and soon whispers spread in business circles about the mysterious investor with unshakable confidence. At the restaurant, staff noticed changes too. Mark's clothes grew sharper, his posture straighter. He still treated them with kindness, but there was a new distance in his eyes, a sense of authority that hadn't been there before. He was no longer merely a man keeping a dream alive. He was a man building an empire. Elizabeth's shadow no longer haunted every corner. She had left him broken, but she would not return to find the man she had abandoned. When their paths crossed again, and Mark felt in his bones that they would, she would meet someone she could never have imagined. The man she once called a failure was gone. In his place stood someone reborn, powerful, confident, untouchable. The weeks turned into months, and with each passing day, Mark's presence in the business world deepened. His investments, once whispers in obscure circles, began to make headlines in local financial columns. The struggling cafe he quietly funded reopened with lines stretching around the block. The dilapidated apartment complex he renovated became sought-after housing. The failing tech startup he rescued launched a product that went viral overnight. Every move seemed calculated, precise, a masterstroke in a grand design only he could see. Businessmen who once dismissed him as a modest restaurant owner now sought meetings with him. Invitations arrived in embossed envelopes, charity galas, networking events, private dinners where fortunes shifted over glasses of wine. Mark attended, but always with a composed, watchful air. He spoke little, listened more, and when he did speak, his words carried weight. People began to call him the quiet kingmaker. Yet behind the sharp suits and polished reputation, he remained disciplined. The fortune gave him freedom, but it did not blind him. Nights still found him at his desk, journal open, pen moving steadily, as he reflected on choices, strategies, and the faint, lingering ache of betrayal. He never forgot the sting of Elizabeth's departure, the way she spat the word failure as if it were his name. That memory became fuel, sharpening his resolve. And though she was gone, Mark could not ignore the thought of her. Somewhere in the city, Elizabeth lived a different life now. He wondered if she read the papers, if she heard his name murmured at office desks or cocktail parties. Did she recognize it was him? Did regret gnaw at her the way her words once gnawed at him? He did not know, and he would not waste effort to find out. He trusted that fate, relentless as time, would bring their paths together again. But when that day came, she would not meet the man she had left. She would meet the man she had created through her cruelty, forged sharper, harder, and far beyond her reach.
By the end of the year, Mark was no longer just a name in financial circles. He had become a symbol. In the city's elite gatherings, whispers followed him, not out of pity, but respect. Newspapers called him a visionary entrepreneur. Employees in his ventures described him as strict but fair, a man who demanded excellence because he lived by it himself. He had built not only businesses, but also an identity untethered from the failures Elizabeth once accused him of. Where she saw weakness, the world now saw strength. Where she spat at his insignificance, others now toasted to his influence. Yet, in private, Mark never lost his sense of vigilance. Wealth was a tool, not a shield. Betrayal had taught him that trust could be shattered in an instant. He built walls, not of stone, but of strategy. Every contract was airtight, every investment layered with safety nets, every partnership carefully tested. And still, in quiet moments, he reflected on the irony. Elizabeth had left searching for security, only for him to become the very embodiment of it. She had abandoned him when the ground trembled, and now he stood firm as a pillar others leaned on. It was during one of those nights of reflection, as he overlooked the city from the balcony of his penthouse, that a thought came unbidden. Sooner or later, her path would cross his again. And when it did, he would decide what kind of justice the past deserved.
Elizabeth's new life was not the glamorous escape she had imagined. When she left Mark, she envisioned freedom, a chance to reinvent herself, to live without the weight of his failures. Instead, she found herself alone in a modest rented apartment, the silence deafening compared to the house she once ruled.
At first, she tried to mask her unease with bravado. She attended dinners with acquaintances, laughing too loudly, pretending she had moved on to something greater. But beneath the surface, cracks grew. Her savings dwindled faster than she anticipated. Her bills stacked high, and the security she once mocked in Mark now seemed like a fortress she had abandoned. The job market was cruel. Employers raised eyebrows at her lack of steady work experience. She had devoted her life to managing a household, raising their daughter, and keeping up appearances, tasks that earned no points on resumes. Rejection letters piled up, each one another nail in the coffin of her pride. The nights were the worst. She scrolled through social media, seeing couples smiling, families vacationing, people celebrating anniversaries. Each picture reminded her of what she had thrown away. Loneliness pressed in on her, whispering doubts she refused to voice. Had she been wrong? Had she given up too soon? She tried to date again, but the men she met were either too shallow, too demanding, or too indifferent. None of them carried the patience Mark once had. None looked at her as if she were the center of their world. Each failed attempt deepened her frustration, feeding an anger she turned inward. Months passed, and her descent grew sharper. From fine wine, she shifted to cheap bottles. From elegant dresses, she settled for clearance racks. From boasting of her freedom, she now avoided conversations altogether. The world she had envisioned no longer existed, only a hollow shell of what once was. And in the back of her mind, an unshakable thought began to stir. Maybe, just maybe, she had made the greatest mistake of her life.
The bills didn't stop coming. Elizabeth was forced to swallow her pride and take whatever work she could find. At first, it was temporary clerical positions, answering phones, filing papers for companies that barely noticed her. The pay was meager, and the hours unpredictable. She told herself it was temporary, but weeks turned into months, and the offers grew no better. She worked in a cafe for a short while, wearing an apron stained with coffee, serving hurried customers who rarely looked her in the eye. The younger staff whispered behind her back, mocking her attempts to act refined in a place that demanded speed over grace. At night, she returned home exhausted, her hands aching, her shoes worn thin. She stared at herself in the bathroom mirror, barely recognizing the woman who once hosted dinners in designer gowns. Her savings dwindled to nothing. She sold her jewelry, piece by piece. The necklace Mark had given her on their 15th anniversary, the gold bracelets she once wore proudly. Each sale felt like tearing a page from her past, leaving her with nothing but the hollow memory of what once was. Shame followed her everywhere. At the grocery store, she counted coins, praying the total wouldn't exceed her limit. She avoided old acquaintances, terrified they would see her reduced to this state. Even her daughter, distant and busy with her own life, became harder to face. Elizabeth lied during their phone calls, insisting everything was fine, that she was managing. But when the nights grew cold and the walls of her apartment seemed to close in, regret gnawed at her more than hunger ever could. She had traded security for pride, love for scorn, a future for an illusion, and now all she had left was survival. The breaking point came on a gray Tuesday afternoon. Elizabeth sat at her kitchen table, bills spread out before her like a battlefield she could no longer win. Her rent was overdue, her cupboards nearly bare, and the landlord's warnings had grown sharper. She held her head in her hands, fighting tears that refused to be contained. For the first time, she admitted to herself she had no way out, no secret savings, no hidden plan, just desperation. That night, she searched job postings again, scrolling endlessly until her eyes blurred. Most positions paid little,
Some demanded skills she didn't have, and others were so demeaning she closed the tab in disgust. But then one ad caught her attention, an administrative assistant role at a rapidly growing investment firm. The salary was decent, the benefits real, and the description vague enough that she might stand a chance. Her heart raced as she read the company name. It sounded familiar, powerful, almost intimidating. She didn't realize why until she clicked through to the company's website. The logo glowed across her screen, modern and sleek, beneath the name Sterling Enterprises. Her breath caught. Mark's name was there, listed boldly under founder and director. Her hands trembled as she closed the laptop, the glow of the screen burning her vision long after it went dark. Fate had delivered her to the crossroads she feared most. If she applied, she risked humiliation. If she didn't, she risked ruin. Elizabeth leaned back in her chair, staring at the cracked ceiling. The irony was cruel, but the choice was clear. Pride could no longer feed her. Only survival could.
Elizabeth's fingers hovered nervously over the keyboard as she filled out the online application for Sterling Enterprises. Her pride screamed at her to close the window, but survival urged her forward. She submitted the form with a trembling hand, her heart pounding as if she had signed away her very soul. Days later, she received an email. Interview scheduled. The words glared back at her, both salvation and damnation in a single sentence. On the morning of the interview, she dressed carefully, piecing together the most professional outfit she could manage. The blazer was slightly faded, the blouse not as crisp as it once was, but she carried herself with practiced poise. As she rode the elevator up the gleaming glass tower of Sterling Enterprises, every reflection reminded her of the woman she once was and the one she had become. The receptionist greeted her politely and directed her to a waiting area. Elizabeth's hands clenched around her purse as she sat, trying to steady her breath. Her mind spun with rehearsed answers, half-truths, and the desperate hope that she could endure whatever came next. Then the door opened, and there he was. Mark entered the room with the quiet authority of a man who had built something from the ground up. He looked older, stronger, sharpened by resilience rather than worn down by defeat. His tailored suit spoke of success, but it was his eyes, steady, unreadable, that struck Elizabeth the hardest. For a moment, the air between them froze. Elizabeth's throat tightened, and she struggled to form words. Mark glanced at the resume on the desk before him, then back at her, his expression controlled but distant. "Elizabeth," he said, his voice even, betraying nothing, "please have a seat." Her legs felt like lead as she lowered herself into the chair opposite him. 1,000 apologies, excuses, and pleas swirled in her mind, but none found their way past her lips. All she could do was meet his gaze, knowing this interview was far more than a test of employment. It was a reckoning.
Mark let the silence stretch between them, deliberately unhurried as he studied her. The last time he had seen Elizabeth, she was walking out the door, leaving 30 years of marriage behind with a final, bitter word. Now she sat before him, shoulders slightly hunched, dignity wrapped in threads of desperation. "You've applied for a position here," he finally said, his tone professional but edged. "I'll be clear, Elizabeth. This is not charity. If you work for Sterling Enterprises, you will earn your place like everyone else." Elizabeth nodded quickly, her voice tight. "Of course, Mark. I don't expect special treatment. I just need the chance." His eyes flicked down to her resume again. "You'll start on probation, 3 months. Your salary will be modest until you prove yourself. Any favoritism, any slip, and you're gone." Elizabeth's throat worked as she swallowed. Humiliation burned at her, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. "I understand." Mark leaned back in his chair, folding his hands. For a flicker of a second, the memory of her leaving flashed across his mind, the contempt in her eyes, the sting of her words. He smothered it. This was business now. "Then we'll see if you can handle the work," he said coolly. "Welcome to Sterling Enterprises, Ms. Hayes." Her heart sank at the formality of her name on his lips. No warmth, no trace of the intimacy they once shared, just the weight of cold professionalism. For Elizabeth, it was both salvation and the harshest punishment of all. Elizabeth's first day at Sterling Enterprises felt like stepping onto a stage where everyone already knew the script except her. She walked through the glass doors with her ID badge clipped neatly to her blazer, the weight of her probation heavy on her shoulders. The open-floor office buzzed with activity, but she could feel eyes flicking toward her, assessing, questioning, whispering. "Isn't that the new hire?" someone murmured as she passed. "I heard she used to be close to Mr. Sterling." Elizabeth kept her chin lifted, pretending not to notice. Every whisper was a knife, slicing open the wounds she tried to keep hidden. She took her assigned desk, small, tucked near the back, far from the executive wing where Mark's office loomed like a fortress. Her tasks were menial at first: data entry, filing reports, cross-checking numbers, work she could do with her eyes closed. But the challenge wasn't the work. It was the suffocating atmosphere. Every time she glanced up, she caught colleagues exchanging knowing looks, their conversations dropping to hushed tones. The rumor of her special connection to the boss had spread like wildfire. At lunch, Elizabeth sat alone, her sandwich untouched. Laughter from a nearby table reached her ears, and though she couldn't catch every word, she knew she was the subject. Shame and anger warred inside her. She wanted to stand up, to shout that she wasn't there for favoritism, that she needed this job. But pride chained her tongue. That afternoon she saw him. Mark walked through the office discussing figures with a manager. He didn't glance her way, didn't acknowledge her presence, yet the effect was immediate. The whispers grew sharper, the stares more blatant. Elizabeth lowered her eyes to her screen, her hands trembling over the keyboard. By the end of the day, exhaustion weighed her down more than the tasks themselves. As she gathered her things, she caught her reflection in the darkened glass of a conference room. Her face looked older, harder, etched with the cost of her choices. This was her reality now, working under the man she had betrayed, enduring whispers that might never fade. And yet, underneath the humiliation, a spark of determination flickered. She would endure. She had to, because survival left her no other choice.
The second week of probation blurred into a fog of repetition. Numbers, spreadsheets, and quiet clerical work filled Elizabeth's days, but her nights were invaded by memories she couldn't control. Sometimes she saw the kitchen table, the one where Mark used to sit, shoulders slumped, bills spread like battle plans in front of him. She remembered how she used to scold him, the venom in her voice sharper with every overdue notice. The memory twisted her stomach now, but back then she had felt only disgust. Other nights she dreamed of the day she left, the door slamming, his silence, the weight of her own rage disguising fear. She would wake drenched in sweat, the echo of her own words, failure, useless, pathetic, ringing in her ears. During work hours, the past didn't leave her alone either. When she typed figures into a database,
Her mind replayed evenings when Mark had asked for patience. When she carried files to the archive, she could almost hear her own cruel laughter from years ago, mocking his broken promises. The whispers in the office only fueled her torment. Colleagues speculated openly, was she an ex-lover, an old flame, or something darker? Elizabeth wanted to scream the truth, but the truth was worse than their guesses. She wasn't just a woman connected to Mark Sterling. She was the wife who had abandoned him when he was at his lowest. One evening, as she stayed late finishing a report, she caught sight of Mark through the glass wall of his office. He was leaning over a contract, his posture calm, his expression unreadable. For a moment, their eyes met across the expanse. Elizabeth froze, her throat dry. But he looked away first, returning to his work without a flicker of acknowledgement. The dismissal stung more than anger would have. Anger she could fight, but indifference, that was unbearable.
By the third week, the weight of whispers had turned suffocating. Elizabeth noticed conversations halting the moment she entered a room. Laughter died quickly, eyes darted away, and yet the tension hung in the air like smoke. Each day at her desk felt like an unending test, one where failure wasn't measured by numbers, but by how much humiliation she could endure. Small mistakes, ones that might have gone unnoticed for any other probationary hire, drew sharp attention. A misplaced decimal, a report filed 5 minutes late, each became another excuse for colleagues to smirk, to murmur, to judge. Elizabeth felt their eyes not only on her work, but on her past, a past that refused to let her breathe. Mark's silence was its own cruelty. He passed through the office often, always dignified, composed, admired. He never once acknowledged her presence beyond a professional nod. No reprimands, no small kindnesses, no recognition of their history. To everyone else, he was simply her boss. To Elizabeth, his indifference was a punishment sharper than any words. One afternoon, as she sat at her desk, she overheard 2 coworkers whispering by the coffee machine. She thinks she's special because she knew him once. Pathetic. I give her a month before she's gone. Elizabeth's fingers tightened around her pen until her knuckles whitened. She wanted to shout, to defend herself, to remind them she had endured more than they could imagine. But instead she swallowed the words. Survival demanded silence. That evening, as the office emptied, she lingered at her desk, staring at the stack of reports in front of her. Her reflection in the monitor seemed like that of a stranger, worn, desperate, fragile. She whispered to herself as if daring the walls to hear, I will not break, not yet.
Okay, friends, this is the end of the first part of the story. The next and final part of the story is already on the channel in the next video called Betrayal's Price, Part 2.